Well, welcome to episode 5 of our series, The Good Shepherd, where we have been looking in depth at Psalm 23. And I think last week I might have been saying that we were in episode 5 when last week was episode 4. But we are in episode 5 right now. And if you have missed any of the previous episodes in this series, you're going to want to go back and check them out. You can find them all on our website at wearegracepoint.com. Click the link that says podcast. And the links to be able to view all of the previous messages are there. So if you have missed any, it would be great for you to catch up. But we have been talking throughout this entire series about this very, very famous psalm that for many people it's the first psalm that they learned. It's the first one that they heard. For a lot of us, it was the first one that we ever memorized. We see it all the time on wall art and on blankets. We see it on greeting cards and on keychains. And one of the things that we have been doing every week here is we've been giving away some Psalm 23 item, just as a reminder that it is common, we see it a lot, but also to remember that there is a deeper message than just what a cursory reading of the text would give. And how we have been looking at it throughout this series is just remembering that the writer of the Psalms, King David, who was one of and perhaps the greatest king of ancient Israel, was a shepherd before he became king. And so when he writes about the Good Shepherd, when he starts off this psalm with the words that the Lord is my shepherd, he is writing that from a perspective of really understanding what it means to be a good shepherd. And so by understanding what a shepherd had to go through in that time, what it took to be a good shepherd helps us to understand deeper what David is trying to say in the context of what he's been saying. And so when we look at this, we've kind of taken his words and made it a little bit more relevant and understandable to what we would understand if David was talking to us today. And he starts off by saying that the Lord is my wise and knowledgeable shepherd. He knows what's going on. He knows the landscape in front of me. He knows the things that are out there that could harm me. He knows what it takes for me to thrive no matter the circumstances. And David is saying he is my wise and knowledgeable shepherd. And because of that, he says, so all my needs are met. He continued on to say, and he said that he settles me down in green pastures. And David talks about how either when we're in the abundance or when we're in the times of lack, that we get the secret of being content in any circumstance and in any situation. He says, he leads me to water where I can rest. And what David is saying there is that God creates the conditions and brings us to a place where we can have a rhythm of rest so that we can be refreshed, not just in our bodies, but also in our soul. And then last week, we looked at David writing, he brings me back. He leads me in paths of right relationship for his name's sake. That path of right relationship is a right relationship with both the shepherd, with a right relationship with God, but it's also a right relationship with the flock. And it's a right relationship with other people. And David says that it is God, his shepherd, that brings him back. In other words, when we wander off the path, when we find ourselves alone, when we make bad decisions, and we end up in a place where we're separated from everyone else, it is God who does the hard work of going out to where we are and picking us up and bringing us back. Well, today we are going to be looking at what David writes next. And David says this. He says, even though I walk through the valley of deep darkness, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Now, a lot of you, for me it was the same. I was raised reading that verse, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And this is a very common phrase, and you may have heard this. In fact, even if you are not a Christian and you're listening with us today, you probably have heard that phrase, the valley of the shadow of death. We use this verse a lot when we are talking in funerals and when we're talking to people in hospitals. This is a very, very common verse. But when we look at, even though it's commonly known as the valley of the shadow of death, when we look at the Hebrew, really what David is talking about, what he's saying is the valley of deep darkness. And what David would have been referring to is this treacherous landscape that exists when the shepherd has to lead his sheep through these deep canyons. Now, all through our series, we've been looking at these photos of the desert from up above. But here are some photos of what it looks like when you're inside those canyons and you have to maneuver through them. And you can see that it's dark and you can see that it's deep. In fact, in this picture, you can see in the corner there a little man who's in there. And so you can kind of get an idea of how big and how deep these canyons are. And see, there are times that the shepherd has to take the flock through those canyons. He has to take them through there to get to their destination. But when it gets dark, when they're in that canyon, it can get very, very dark, even during the daytime, and it can get pretty scary. Now, when a shepherd is leading his flock through the canyons present problems for the shepherd that the shepherd has to know about. And some of these problems we talked about when we started in episode 1. One of the concerns for the shepherd is that while he is leading his flock through that deep canyon, that he might run into a flash flood. And we talked about this in the first week, that the number one cause of death in the desert was not heat exhaustion. The number one cause of death in the desert is flash floods, because the floods come up and they come up quickly. And if the shepherd is caught with his sheep in the canyons when there is a flood, it could be trouble for the shepherd and for the sheep. So the shepherd has to know the canyon, and he has to know where the water would come from, and he has to know that it's going to be safe before he takes his flock through that canyon. The other thing that's in that canyon, the other thing of concern for the shepherd are the predators. We also talked about this in the first week, that there are lions and there are bears, that there are animals that are waiting to devour the sheep. And those animals in those canyons would be lurking in the shadows. And so as you're walking through and you see the shadows in this valley of deep darkness, you don't know what is hiding behind those shadows. You don't know what's hiding behind those rocks. You don't know what's hiding in those cliffs. And just seeing it like this can bring out fear. There are places that the shepherd has to lead the flock through. He just has to. Kenneth Bailey wrote a book called The Good Shepherd, and we have been, taking a look at some quotes from there. And I want to read this one. Listen to what he writes about this valley of deep darkness. He says, "The valley of death, of deep darkness, is a section of the trail that cannot be avoided. There is no bypass road and no magical escape. The only way forward is through the valley." This is true of a shepherd shepherding his flock, and it is just as true in our lives. Because when we talk about the valley of deep darkness, the valley of the shadow of death, it's not just talking about death. Yeah, we use this verse at funerals. We use this verse when we are talking to or encouraging the sick. But really what David is referring to here, and what he's trying to give the idea to us is that the valley of deep darkness is anything in our lives that really concerns us. See, the valley of deep darkness can be sickness, physical sickness, but it can also be an issue that we're having in our finances. Our valley of deep darkness can be problems that we're having in our marriage or problems that we're having with our kids. Valleys of deep darkness can be the result of our bad decisions. They are the places where you and I feel vulnerable. And it's those places that sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, we can't go around it. We can't bypass it. We can't not go through it. We have to go through it. And so what do we do when we find ourselves in this valley of deep darkness? Whether it's life that leads us there or whether it's our decisions that brought us there, what do we do when we find ourselves in a place of darkness, in a dark valley? What do we do? Well, one of the things that we need to do that here in the West we have a difficult time doing is we have to learn to grieve and to grieve well. There are people who, when they're facing that valley of darkness, they don't want to enter into it. They don't want to enter into the grieving process because we just don't grieve well. In fact, especially here in our Western culture, we try to push aside the grieving process. And so there are people who will insist on not having a funeral, but instead have a celebration of life. And listen, I'm not saying that there's any problem with that. But if you don't give people time to grieve the loss and just tell them everything is going to be okay, they're not able to enter and walk through that valley, through that grieving process. We all need to grieve. And when we lose a family member, we need to grieve. But we all grieve other things too. That we grieve when we lose a job. We grieve over a lost relationship. We grieve over a business that has closed or a child that has left and hasn't returned. We need to grieve. The problem for a lot of people is that they get stuck in the grief. See, valleys in our lives are the result of being in a situation where we have lost control, where we don't have control over the situation. That is what is the feeling that's inside of us when we are in the valley. And one of the ways that we maintain control, or we trick ourselves into thinking that we maintain control, is by hanging on to the anger and the bitterness of the things that either drove us into the valley or the things that are waiting for us in the valley. There are valleys that we just can't avoid. We have to face them head on and we have to move through them, but we have to move through them at the right pace. And doing that can be hard. I remember one time we were up in Seattle. I think I was there for a graduation in that area, and then afterwards we went into Seattle to visit. And there was a restaurant that my kids wanted to go to, a restaurant that was at a shopping center that was just really close by the hotel. Well, when you look at it on your phone, you just see, you go down these roads and you're there. And so we started walking, and one of the roads, which looked like a regular road, but when we got to it, it was actually an alley. And it was strange because this alley was not like a tiny alley like you would expect in a big city. The alley was actually a full-size road. It was pretty wide. But there were no windows facing. The sides of the buildings were pretty much, all bricked or concrete or over. There were doors, but none of the doors had windows. Most of them were metal and most of them were closed. There were no people walking through, and I don't know if it was the time of the day or the tall buildings, but when you were on the main road, everything was bright and there were a lot of cars coming through, but when you made that turn down that alley, it was just dark. It was dark in there, and there were lots of shadows. It almost felt like you were in a black and white movie because everything was just shades of gray. It was so dark in that alley. And I'll tell you that I was walking through there, and fear started to creep up inside me. And I started to look around and think, okay, well, what if somebody jumps out of there? What am I going to do? What if somebody jumps out of there? What am I going to do? And all these thoughts start running through my head, and then I start thinking, and I thought, okay, well, if someone comes out and starts chasing us, I don't have to outrun him. I just have to outrun everybody else who's with me, which is not really a cool thing, but you think and start thinking of weird things when you are in the valley of deep darkness. These are the feelings that we get, and that's why David says that he walks through the valley of the darkness, but even though he walks through that valley of deep darkness, that valley of the shadow of death, David says, I will fear no evil. And there's a common saying, in fact, you might have heard this or seen this on social media, where it says that do not fear is the number one commandment in the Bible, that it's there over 365 times, so there's one do not fear for every day of the year. And I'll tell you that that really isn't true. It does not appear 365 times. Now, do not fear does appear more than any other commandment. It's more than 100 times. And it's important for us to say, to understand what David is saying here. He says, I will fear no evil. Now, we think that that means that we're not supposed to have any fear at all at any time. But I don't think that's what David is talking about. I don't think that's what he means. In fact, I don't think that's what it means in most places where we find this phrase, do not fear, mentioned in the Scriptures. Because listen, fear is a good thing. Fear is a gift. Without fear, we wouldn't know what is important and what isn't. We wouldn't know the things in our lives that we need to pay attention to if there wasn't fear. It's like pain, like physical pain. You know, sometimes we experience physical pain. In fact, as we get older, we start to experience even more physical pain. And sometimes you may have had moments, I know that I've had moments where I just wish that the pain is so bad or the pain is so constant that you wish that you just wouldn't feel pain anymore. The pain would just disappear. But can you imagine how dangerous it would be if we never felt pain? That we could be walking around and we could put our hand down on a hot stove and we wouldn't feel anything. In fact, the only reason we would know that our hand was on the hot stove is because pretty soon we would start to smell our flesh burning and we would look at our hand and it's already burned down to the bone, but we didn't know because we didn't feel pain. Or what if you didn't feel pain, you didn't get any stomach aches anymore? And so you're eating and you're walking around, you don't feel any pain, and then all of a sudden you just throw up because you have been ill this whole time, but because you didn't feel your stomach pain, you didn't know that something was wrong. Imagine if you'd never felt any chest pain. The people would walk around, they wouldn't feel any tightness, they wouldn't feel any pain in their chest. They could be having a heart attack and wouldn't feel anything, and then they would just fall down dead. We need pain. Pain protects us. And fear is the same way. Fear protects us. Fear makes us pay attention to our surroundings. Fear lets us know that there is something significant that we are going through. It's a very natural emotion for you and me to have. Fear actually is only an issue when the fear causes us to freeze, when it causes us to panic, when it causes us to stop moving forward. Fear becomes dangerous when it leads to paralysis. Fear is important. It tells us that there's something going on that we have to pay attention to. But if we allow fear to paralyze us, then we can't move forward through the valley. And so when the sheep are in the valley, they are going to experience a little fear. They're going to experience a little apprehension, but it doesn't paralyze them. It doesn't keep them from moving forward. For followers of Jesus, this can be a problem. Because sometimes we think that if we feel fear, it means that we don't trust God enough. If we feel fear, we feel like we're being disobedient to God's word, like we're not a good Christian if we feel fear. Now, of course, there is an aspect to it of trust and of faith. I mean, you have to know God to be able to trust God, especially when you're going through those dark valleys in our lives. But fear isn't a bad thing. Fear is a good thing. Fear can be helpful as long as it doesn't stop you from going through the valley. And sometimes if you are a follower of Jesus, even when you're feeling that fear, it's helpful to step back a little bit. To remember that while the things we're going through in our lives are important, and that they aren't significant, and that they can have a lasting influence well into the future, that this life that we're living in is just a grain of sand in the beach of eternity. And that even if the absolute worst thing that can happen happens to us, if we face death, that we still have the peace of knowing that the very next thing we will see is the face of Jesus. And remembering that, looking at it from that perspective, that can be helpful. So for the sheep and the goats, when they're going through the valley of deep darkness, what keeps them from having the kind of fear that overwhelms them, that paralyzes them, what keeps them going through the valley is that they are following a shepherd. David says, I will not fear because for you are with me. Now remember in the first episode I said that this psalm was very interesting, and one of the reasons that I found it so interesting is that it was so short. It's only 57 Hebrew words. Well, get this. Before this phrase, the phrase, for you are with me, before that phrase, there are 26 Hebrew words. And then after that phrase, there are 26 Hebrew words. Now, this is a literary device that is intentional in order to put focus on that phrase, for you are with me, in order to focus us on that idea. In other words, God's presence, the fact that God is with me, is the focal point of this entire psalm. See, this is the point where the psalm turns. Up to now, it's been, He makes me, He settles me, He leads me, He brings me back. But then all of a sudden here it turns, and now David isn't talking about God. David is now talking to God. He's saying, God, you are with me. The good shepherd is there with him, and David says, you are with me right now. And this is why you and I can be confident, because the shepherd is with us. And one of the most challenging things in our lives is that when we find ourselves in the darkest valleys, it always feels like we're going through it all alone. And men, listen, we know we are the worst at this. Because when we are in the dark valleys, we men tend to pull back from everything and from everyone. We don't want to talk to our friends. We don't want to talk to our parents. We don't want to talk to our spouses. We don't want to talk to anyone. Because inside we feel like no one else is going to get it. No one else understands what I'm going through. No one else can deal with what it is that I'm dealing with. And we actually talk ourselves into feeling like we are all alone. And I know that there's a lot of you women who are out there who do the same thing. And it's not that we want to go through things alone, but sometimes we choose to. We choose to go through the tough times alone. But when you and I can recognize that even in the deepest, darkest valleys, that God is with us, that's when things start to actually change inside us. And listen, it's not just that God is with us. It's that others are with us too. Remember, David is using this image of the shepherd and the flock. Not the shepherd and one sheep, but the shepherd and a flock. A shepherd always leads a flock. And David is using this imagery to remind us that when we are in the valley, we're not only in the valley with our shepherd, we are in the valley with the other sheep. We are in the valley in community together. We are not alone. Back in 2018, the actor Ben Affleck checked into a rehab center for alcohol addiction. And while he was in there, he posted a picture on Instagram, and this is what he captioned on that picture. He said, "So many people have reached out on social media and spoken about their own journeys with addiction. To those people, I want to say thank you. Your strength is inspiring and is supporting me in ways I didn't think was possible. It helps to know that I am not alone." There's something special that happens when we recognize that we are not going through anything unique. We are not going through anything special. We are not the first person ever to experience this, and we don't have to experience it alone. God is with us in the valley of deep darkness. He is walking with us. He doesn't leave us alone. He doesn't just sit back and say, all right, you got yourself into this. Now let's see how you get yourself out of it. No, He is with us. He is with you. He's walking right there with you. But we also have to remember that I am also not alone because there are other people with me. I am part of a flock. I am part of a community. And it's important to remember that because of this. God works most often through other people. You know, when you're having a financial challenge, I've never heard anyone give a testimony and say, yeah, I was short a couple of $100 from paying all of my bills at the end of the month. And one day I was sitting eating breakfast and all of a sudden money just materialized on my kitchen table. Just like Star Trek, somebody had beamed it in, right? It doesn't happen like that. It's usually, I was running out of money. I didn't know how I was going to make my bills. And then there was this guy who I had lent money to a long time ago. I forgot I had lent him money. And just out of the blue, he came up and he paid me the money he owed me. And that was the money that I needed to pay my bills. Right? That's the story we hear. Or my boss gave me a bonus that I wasn't expecting. Or someone just wrote me a check that I didn't know. God works through other people. In our lives, God works through other people. God works through doctors and medical professionals. God works through marriage counselors and financial planners. God works through you for my benefit, and God works through me for your benefit. The vertical and the horizontal are connected. God works through the people in our lives to help us navigate through the deep darkness. In the book, The Bible and the Land, Gary Burge writes this about that deep valley, that wilderness experience. He says, wilderness experiences can either become remarkable opportunities for renewal and faith, or they can become opportunities for bitterness and anger. In a word, when each person stands in the wilderness of their own desolation, they must decide how to respond. Many Israelites never arrived at the Holy Land, but instead died in the wilderness. The wilderness stories punctuated with accounts of men and women exhibiting marked anger and resentment that Moses and his God were not doing a better job of managing things. See, it's easy when we are in the deepest, darkest valleys. It's easy for us to become angry and upset. And listen, when you are in the darkness of the valley, there are a lot of things to be angry and upset about. It's not unreasonable to find yourself in there and have these feelings of anger rise up in you. But what we can't do is to allow those things to prevent us from walking through the valley and also from walking through it well. Because listen, there are people that are going to go through, they're going to get through those deep, dark valleys without a shepherd and without a flock. But they usually don't go through it well. They'll get through, but they come through bitter, and they come through angry, and they come through with unforgiveness, and they come through with hurt, and they come through feeling damaged. And they may leave the darkness of the valley, but the darkness doesn't leave them. He also writes that the wilderness is a theological symbol for flight and deprivation, for suffering and loss, for his vulnerability and helplessness, for dislocation and confusion. But it is also the spiritual setting where renewal takes place, where men and women in the midst of their crisis discover something about God that they had not known before. My prayer for you is that as you walk through the deep, dark valleys, that you would discover something new about our Good Shepherd, something that you didn't know before, and then that you would realize that you have to move through the valley, that you have to engage what is in the valley, but that you don't have to do it alone. That our Good Shepherd is with us and that we are in it together, so that you can say with peace and with confidence that even though I walk through the valley of deep darkness, I will fear no evil, for you, God, are with me.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.